Hey friends, thank you so much for being here. Today we're going to dive into some common mistakes that beginners often make with watercolor. And the only reason I know these is because I've done them all. Whether you're just starting out with watercolor or you've been painting for years, mistakes still happen because we're human. In today's video, not only am I going to show you how to prevent some of these mistakes, but I'll also show you how to fix them. I'm going to preface this by saying that having good quality watercolor paper is so important. So before we go on, please make sure that your watercolor paper is 100% cotton and at least 140 pound or 300 GSM. If it isn't, some of the mistakes that you might be experiencing could be the paper's fault, not yours. Also, we're going to be talking about lifting and scrubbing a lot, and there are some brushes that are better for that than others. I recommend a firm brush with synthetic bristles that's on the smaller side. My favorite brush is this Princeton Snap brush. It's actually a size 0 round. The bristles are really firm, so it can withstand some of the work that we're going to be doing on the paper. Brushes with natural bristles tend to be softer, so they don't do as well when you need some firm pressure, and they also hold a lot more water typically than a synthetic brush, and too much water is what gets us into a lot of these mistakes in the first place. So synthetic bristles are a little bit easier to manage when it comes to water control. So you may want to experiment and get yourself a designated scrubbing lifting brush. So once you're sure you've got good quality paper and a firm brush for scrubbing, let's talk about mistake number 1. Now, let's say you simply put your brush in the wrong place on your paper. I've bumped my brush, gotten a little carried away with my brush strokes before, and ended up with paint in an area that I didn't want it. Did you know that sometimes you can actually remove that paint? Let's talk about a few different scenarios. So let's say you're painting along and you just accidentally dab some paint in the wrong place. The first thing you should do is grab your paper towel and immediately press down on it. Don't rub, just apply pressure and lift. You can see that a decent amount of the paint did come up, but not all of it did. What if you make a mistake and you have a line of paint or a dab of paint somewhere on your paper where you don't want it to be? You wanted the paper to stay white, but it's already dried. Use a clean brush, grab some clean water, and gently paint the water over the spot that you want to remove. You want a decent amount of water and you want to be very gentle so you don't smear the paint as it activates. Let it sit for a few minutes. While it's sitting there, that water is going to reactivate the paint, which can loosen it. Now grab your paper towel and blot it up. So you can see that it did lift some paint, but there's definitely still some there. So to get the rest of that paint out, you could take your scrubbing lifting brush, a clean damp brush, and rub over that paint and work it out. But what I have found that works even better is a Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. This is one of the magic eraser sheets, but those bigger scrub brushes that they make work just as well. My friend Kim from Pink Anchor Creations told me about this trick, and I've heard other artists mention it too. I just had to try it and it works. So huge thanks to Kim for sharing this with me. And I have her channel linked below as well. So get your magic eraser wet and gently scrub over the paint. This is going to scuff up your paper, so you have to be very gentle. As long as you're very gentle, your paper shouldn't tear or pill. So now you can see that the paint is almost completely gone. If you have a bunch of other things going on in your painting, you're not going to notice that. Just remember to be so gentle with this so that you don't tear your paper. Also, another reason why it's so important to use high quality paper can really take a beating compared to the lower quality stuff. So now I have my lifting scrubbing brush, my firm bristled brush, and I'm going to dry it off so that it's just barely damp and try to lift some of this up the other way. So if you don't have the magic eraser. So when you're doing this, you have to frequently clean and dry your brush because it's going to lift up paint and you don't want to smear that paint around. So you have to keep cleaning that paint that it lifts off of your brush. Okay, so there's that one. The magic eraser definitely got more of this off, but it did also take off a tiny bit of my paper with it. The last thing I want to mention is that some watercolor paints are staining. If you make a mistake and you're using a paint that's labeled as staining, it's going to be even more difficult to remove. You can tell if your paint is staining by checking the label. The label on the tube sometimes will tell you, or you can just look it up online. So I was using ultramarine, which is typically a non-staining paint, whereas like permanent rose is staining. Paints that are non-staining will lift off your paper a little more easily. Common mistake number 2 is blooms. Sometimes we love blooms, sometimes we hate blooms. So let's talk about those a little bit more. The reason a bloom looks this way is because essentially this fresh water that we have added here, this very watery paint, the water repels the pigment and pushes it to the very outside edge of the line of the water. And because it's pushing all of the pigment to the outside edge, it creates a very dark, thick line that really stands out. But thankfully, we can often reactivate this, lift up those hard edges, and move them around to even them out. Sometimes we want this look. It's one of those beautiful things that we can create in watercolor, and there are a million different uses for these, but when we don't want them, at least we know that there are ways that we can fix them. Blooms happen when you have paint that is wet or damp, and then we add more paint to it that has more water in it than the original layer. It's so easy to make a bloom. Here are 2 ways to prevent them. Number 1, only add more paint if your first layer is still very wet. Or wait until your first layer is completely dry. The water absorbs so deep into the paper it can be impossible to tell if it's wet just from looking at it. So you can test if it's dry by taking the back of your hand and gently touching the paint. If it's cool to the touch, it's still wet. You can blast it with your hairdryer just to be sure that it's dry. Adding paint to a damp layer of paint is the easiest way to create a bloom. The second way that you can prevent a bloom from happening is to remove any excess water or puddles from your painting with a clean, damp brush. We call this a thirsty brush because it literally slurps up the water. You can turn any brush into a thirsty brush simply by drying it. This happens to me all the time when I'm painting flowers. See this puddle here that was left behind in this petal? I'm going to clean my brush, dry it on my paper towel, and then let the bristles just soak up that extra paint. And now the puddle is gone. The problem with leaving that puddle behind is that this part of the petal is going to dry faster than the part with the puddle. So potentially you could have some damp paint right up against some very wet paint, and that is the recipe for a bloom. So just check your paper for puddles like this as you're painting and soak them up as needed. What if you still end up with an unwanted bloom? If it's still wet, you can just grab a little bit of paint and paint over that entire area again. You want to make sure that your brush isn't overly wet because you could just make the problem worse, but you also don't want your brush to be overly dry because if it's very dry, you'll actually just lift the paint that's already there. So you can see that because it was wet, I was able to really easily just lift that hard edge. And now it's all one even color. Let's say the bloom has dried. You can simply paint over it with the same color again with a medium amount of water on your brush, just like before. Not too much water to create puddles, not too little water to lift the paint off entirely. And again, this depends on the type of paper you're using and how high quality it is. It also depends on the type of paint you're using and if the color is staining or not. All of these factors play into how easily you'll be able to remove this bloom. So by painting over this area gently with my brush, I have reactivated the paint from the bloom, and you can see that it lifted right up, and I'm just trying to evenly distribute it around the rest of this area that I've painted. You will have to repaint the entire area though when you're trying to correct a bloom. Spot treatments will stand out and possibly even create more blooms. Now, if you have a different technique for removing blooms that works well for you, please share it below in the comments because we would all love to hear about it so we can learn some other ways of doing this. The third and final common mistake that I'll talk about today is creating hard edges when layering instead of soft ones. Sometimes in watercolor, when we are adding layers, we want those harsh lines to show a clear distinction between the two colors, but other times we want the colors to kind of blend into each other seamlessly. So let's say I'm painting a leaf, and I want to add some darker green here as a shadow. The easiest way to do that, to avoid harsh lines, is to add in that dark green while my leaf is still wet. So here you can see I have the lighter leaf color and then the darker leaf shadow coming in underneath. And because I did it right away while my leaf was still very wet, the water is doing all of that blending work for me so that it's a nice soft fade. What if you've painted a leaf, but by the time you go back to add in your darker green shadow, your leaf is already dry, or maybe it's damp, so then you are at risk for creating a bloom if you go in to add some more paint. You can still add that darker green and make it blend by re-wetting the entire leaf. And you want to just be very gentle because if you push too hard with your brush, you can lift some of that paint. Okay, so now my entire leaf is wet and I'm going to grab my darker green and just drop it in now. And then I'm just going to clean my brush and dry it and just kind of move this paint around to help it flow towards the lighter green. So now I have my darker green shadow here. What if you have a dry leaf and you go in with your darker green and you paint it wet on dry? Now that has created a really hard edge between the dark green and the light green. It's really obvious that I've painted this line here, but I really wanted this dark green to fade into the lighter green. You can still fix this. Let it dry, re-wet the entire leaf. First, I'm going to take my scrubbing brush and just try to soften up this line a little bit. And now I'm going to just repaint that entire leaf. So adding in my light green and then adding in my dark green. Using a clean, damp brush to kind of blend those greens together. So it's not the softest transition between colors here, but considering we had 2 layers of dry paint, re-wetting the whole leaf and painting it over again did certainly add a little bit of soft blending on this part of the leaf here. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. A lot of the time, they're fixable. And some of our greatest watercolor discoveries are going to happen in those painting sessions where we take big risks. Don't let the fear of making a mistake hold you back from taking that risk. As long as we're putting paint to paper, we're learning and we're getting better regardless of the end result. As always, I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.